There are a series of policy decisions that have drastically affected the affordability of houses and built up a very precarious situation that now looks about to get much worse.
Before the mini-budget, the outlook was pretty scary. After the mini-budget, it became, frankly, terrifying. We're sort of back into a scary housing market rather than a terrifying one.
The Conservatives have taken almost every opportunity they've had to inflate the housing market since at least as far back as the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher introduced the policy of right to buy, which gave very large numbers of people the right to buy their council house, restricted the supply of social housing, and began a decades-long kind of galloping market in housing.
The Conservative-controlled GLC had invited Mrs Thatcher to hand the keys of the house over to 91 Bathurst Gardens, a three-bedroom property in North London. Estate agents do say that at £10,500, the couple have a potentially valuable house and the councillor rid of an eyesore.
On top of that, successive Conservative governments have introduced other policies like Help to Buy, which is a very, very large programme of equity loans, most of which were used by people who didn't really need them, but again, inflated demand for housing, allowed people to borrow even more cheaply. And then during the pandemic, there were the suspension of stamp duty and the changing of thresholds that again made it even cheaper to buy a house. And at every point that kept adding demand into a system that was already flooded with demand. There are lots of empty houses in the UK. There's more than 200,000 empty houses in the UK. But there is a crisis of affordability. Prices have got so high. Even when debt was really cheap, houses were unaffordable. Now that situation is changing because debt is getting more expensive.
Over the last few weeks, we've seen a scaling back of how high people expect interest rates to get. Financial markets now expect something like 5%. The Bank of England itself thinks maybe closer to 4.5%. A year ago, interest rates were 0.1%. For the last 15 years, interest rates, the Bank of England's base rate in Britain has been 1% or less. And suddenly we're in a world of 3% interest rates. Moving from under 1% to 3% might not sound like much, but house prices have risen an enormous amount since before the financial crisis. So the level of debts that people are trying to service are now much higher. For a typical person that bought their house in the late 2010s, you're looking at a £350 increase in mortgage costs.
Analysts and lenders are now predicting that house prices could fall by somewhere between 8 and as much as 30% over the next year. That's principally to do with the price of debt. Last year, you could get a mortgage charged less than 1% interest. Now, the average interest rate on a 2-year fixed rate mortgage is over 6%. First of all, that means there are a lot of people who can't get into the market now. It also means there are a lot of people who may be forced to sell if they can't afford the payments on their mortgage. That will drastically impact demand, which will impact sale prices. That 30% figure is not entirely improbable. That's around the amount the price of houses in London dropped by when there was a recession in the early 90s. And you've already got house builders predicting that they won't be able to build as many houses.
How will the big house builders react? Well, they won't just keep building big estates that that they can't sell. They will cut back on activity. Construction is about 7% of our economy. A slowdown in house building, directly hits construction output as well.
The affordability crisis has very much come home to roost, and a correction in the market is inevitable.
It's not just homeowners who are going to suffer here. If a lot of landlords who are buy-to-let landlords who have a mortgage, they are obviously going to try and pass on their rising mortgage costs to their tenants. Now, you might say they didn't pass on low rates to their tenants, and I'm sure they didn't. But they will try and pass on rising rates to their tenants. I think what we're seeing in some inner city rental markets now is it's basically a race between landlords trying to pass on rising costs and whatever the end point is, how much tenants can pay, before they physically can't pay anymore.
Next month, for the first time, it looks likely that the average property rental in London will go over £2,000 a month. So the Conservatives not only incentivise people to buy houses, but they incentivise them to buy more houses because they allowed people tax reliefs on the income from being a landlord. the Cameron-Osborne government allowed people to take money out of their pensions when they hit 55 and invest it in something lucrative, which for a lot of people was a house to rent out to other people. Now, all of those landlords are now looking at, firstly, at the cost of paying debt if they have a mortgage on that property. They're also looking at things like no-fault evictions or keeping pets in houses that are making them think, actually, this isn't worth the bother. So loads of landlords are getting out of the market. But that's not great for renters because it means there are fewer houses to rent. So renters who are considering buying a house are even more choked off from getting on that first rung on the housing ladder than they were before, because not only is it much more expensive to borrow the money to buy a house, but also the rent they're paying will be eating into their deposit much more quickly. The best way out is probably for house prices to stagnate for a long time. House price rises are inflation. They don't really benefit people in the way that they think they do.
When you look at the British economy, what happens in the housing market doesn't stay in the housing market. For most people that own a house, it's their most important asset. And sort of rising house prices have underpinned lots of other sorts of consumption. If people think the value of their asset is rising, they're more comfortable borrowing to spend on other things. If house prices start to rise, you start to see that wealth effect go into reverse. People feel less wealthy, they feel less well off, they will cut back on other types of spending. If they've got a mortgage and suddenly they've got to find hundreds of pounds a month to meet their mortgage payments, what do they spend less on? They spend less on going out, they spend less on going on holiday. It's all of these non-essential bits of spending which get cut back, especially when you're also seeing your energy bills rising. The fallout of moving from ultra low interest rates to something approaching more historically normal levels is going to be really painful.